Hello and welcome to Eastside Stories. My name is Michael Lewis. I'm a third-generation Eastside resident and longtime board member at the Eastside Heritage Center. The Eastside Heritage Center has brought this series of presentations to you to give you an overview of the history of the East Side. We hope this will be interesting for those of you who've lived here a long time and those of you who maybe have just arrived. Now, for those of you who are not really familiar with the geography here, we're talking about the communities that are on the east of Seattle across Lake Washington. Lake Washington is about 17 miles long and 2 miles wide and provides a pretty definitive barrier between Seattle and the communities to the east, although there are two major bridges that cross it and provide access to it. You may be familiar with some of the cities on the east side: Bellevue, Redmond, Kirkland, Issaquah, and there are quite a number of other wonderful communities over here on the east side, which I hope you'll get to enjoy sometime. Now, our purpose here is to put the East Side into some historic context. You know, it's really part of the greater Seattle region, part of the Puget Sound region, and as we'll see in a few minutes, really part of the history of the whole evolution of the west coast of the United States. The East Side began as a rural area, in a resource area. It became a very important and vibrant suburb, and now it's really an urban community, quite dense, with quite an impressive economy in its own right. Now, before we begin the story, of course, we need to be clear that the East Side was not an empty, in the greater Puget Sound area, was not an empty place when the story starts. Native Americans, of course, had been here for thousands of years. The Salish people were one of the few Native American communities in the country that tended to stay in one place. This was an area where they could live year-round. But the tribes and peoples did move up and down through Puget Sound and what's now British Columbia along the inland waterways. So these were very vibrant communities and that intersected, and as we'll see in a minute, with the people who came out here, the people of European origin who came out here to settle. Now, we're going to begin our story about 1840. Prior to 1840, there really wasn't a lot of activity out here among people of European descent. The area had been explored by the English, by the Spanish, by Russians, by the French, but there were very few actual settlers out here during that time. And there were a series of events that happened starting in the 1840s, and we'll walk through those. The first thing that really started to happen was the Oregon Trail, and that had been pioneered in the 1830s. The first major group to come along the Oregon Trail set out in 1843. So prior to this, there really wasn't much going on here in the Northwest. This map, which was produced in 1846, shows what the western half of the United States looked like at that time. The pink part in the middle was called Alta California, or Upper California, and it was part of Mexico. And mostly there were very few Mexican people or people other than local natives living in that area, except along the coast. But this was part of Mexico. Above that, you'll see the yellow part that extends to the top of the mast from what is now the Oregon-California border. That was known as Oregon Country. And Oregon Country was claimed by both the United States and Britain, but they really didn't do much about it. It was sort of open country, and anyone who wanted to settle out there could, but if you did, you weren't really sure what you were settling into. So people on the early days of the Oregon Trail were coming out into an area that was administered somewhat lightly by either Great Britain or the United States. Beginning in the 1840s, a series of events took place over a fairly short period of time that will change that map forever. The first of these events was the settling of the border between the United States and what's now Canada. As you saw in the map, the yellow area extended fairly far north, up to the 54th parallel. You may remember a phrase, 54-40 or fight, which was certain elements in the United States urging the United States seize the land all the way up to the northern part of that map. But the United States and Britain got together and simply extended the existing border between the United States and what's now Canada along the 49th parallel. At that point, it ended at the Rocky Mountains, and they simply extended it west. But when they got to the Strait of Georgia, they didn't simply go straight across Vancouver Island. They pulled the border down around the southern part of Vancouver Island, and for a very good reason. The inland waters there were really valued by both countries. North of San Francisco, you really don't have a safe place to get a ship inland until you get up to the Strait of Juan de Fuca. All of the ports along the west coast north of San Francisco are river ports, and they have bars in front of them, which are very dangerous today, and they were certainly even more dangerous and difficult to traverse in the days of sailing ships. So having access to the inland waters of what's now Puget Sound and the Strait of Georgia was really important for both countries. So the boundary was drawn into the Strait of Georgia and then south around the bottom of Vancouver Island. Now, those of you who've been to the San Juan Islands and heard the story of the Pig War know that that wasn't really a very precise process, because the treaty simply said that the boundary would follow the major body of water. Well, it turns out there are two bodies of water of about the same size, Haro Strait and Rosario Strait, on either side of the San Juan Islands, and there was a dispute for about a decade trying to figure out which side of the San Juan Islands the border should be drawn on. Ultimately, it was drawn to the north, and the San Juan Islands are part of the United States now. But once that border was drawn, people coming out west on the Oregon Trail or by ship knew that they were now settling within the United States. And that was an important thing. Most of the settlers were heading down toward Portland, or toward Oregon in the Willamette Valley, and they would now be part of the United States. Those people down south of the Columbia River started to get their act together, and they formed a state fairly soon. And the Washington Territory, then to the north of the Columbia River, would be several decades before it became a state. The next big event was the war with Mexico. And this took place extending all the way from what's now Texas out to the Pacific Ocean. And during the war, the United States seized all those lands that are now north of the Mexican border, the states of Arizona, New Mexico, Texas, Nevada, Colorado, and California. And some compensation was paid to the Mexican government for that, but for the most part, the United States simply seized all that land and made it part of the United States. So at that point, within just a couple of years, what had been the West Coast had been not part of the United States and now was. You'll recall the term manifest destiny about extending the country all the way to the Pacific Ocean. Well, that happened by then. Now, the establishment of California as part of the United States would not have been a huge deal immediately, except for the next big event, which was the California Gold Rush. In 1849, gold was discovered at Sutter's Mill near Sacramento, and thousands of people came to California in search of gold. They came overland, they came by ship, they came away from as far away as Chile and Asia. People could cross the Isthmus of Panama and pick up a ship on the other side and come up the coast. Thousands of people coming into California. Now, this is very important for our story because Northern California doesn't have a lot of natural resources. And of course, the people coming there weren't really very interested in doing anything other than looking for gold. So the people of San Francisco and Sacramento in that area needed materials, and they would find those materials in Puget Sound. And we'll hear more about that in a little bit. The next big event was the founding of Seattle. Now, the people coming out the Oregon Trail would typically come to what's now Portland, and they would turn left and they would head down to the Willamette Valley. The Willamette Valley, as you know, is a beautiful area, very good farmland, very nice weather. It was quite a nice place to settle. Well, a certain group, led by a man named Arthur Denny, decided to turn right and head north. Now, actually, only 2 members of the party directly turned right and came on an overland route. The rest of the party got on a boat and came up the coast and down into Puget Sound. They rendezvoused on what's now Alki Point in Seattle in November of 1851. Now, if you've ever been on Alki Point in November, you know that it's not a very hospitable place. It could be quite harsh weather out there. And it's recorded that the women in the party wept upon arrival. They had a newborn baby with them. But they managed to finish the cabin that the 2 men had started, and within a couple of months, a ship arrived from San Francisco looking to buy logs to make pilings in San Francisco Bay. And the Denny party managed to cut enough logs and sell them to the captain of that ship. That was the first transaction that happened in the city of Seattle, and the first of what became a very long and business relationship between Seattle and the Bay Area that continues to this day. The next big event was the Treaty of Point Elliot. And there was a governor at the time, Isaac Stevens, who was very aggressive about removing Indians from their lands and placing them on reservations. And he did this through a series of treaties, one of which was the Treaty of Point Elliot, that covered the area around Seattle. And all of the Native American people in that area were then moved to reservations, most of which still exist today. So by the 1860s, what's now the Seattle area and the East Side was largely emptied out of people. And that sort of set the stage for the next big event, which actually took place back in Washington, D.C. And that was the signing of the Homestead Act by President Lincoln. Now, what the Homestead Act said was that anyone, whether you were a United States citizen or an immigrant who hadn't become a citizen yet, could lay claim to up to 80 acres of vacant land. And all you had to do was put some stakes in the ground that had been surveyed and make some improvements to that land, build a house, start farming it, do something, and for a period of time, if you could prove you had done that, you would get title to the land. This is an image of one of the homestead maps, and it shows how the area was carved up. Federal surveyors came out in the 1850s and surveyed the Puget Sound area, establishing sections, townships, and ranges, and then those formed the basis for carving up the land into homesteads. This particular map shows the areas of Medina and Hunts Point, and you see the grids that are there and the diagonals indicating the land that has been set aside for the individuals whose names are then written on it. And the entire east side was homesteaded in fairly short order. Now, the purpose of the first homesteading was largely around timber, particularly in the areas along Lake Washington, because they could cut the trees, float them into the lake, and get them to a mill. But gradually, homesteaders settled in the area who wanted to farm, and if they couldn't get the timber to the waters where they could get it to a mill, they simply burned it. But settlers began to homestead the entire east side in the 1870s, and we'll pick up that story in our next video. So let's review a little bit where we are as far as the east side. Seattle has now been settled. By 1860, it has maybe 10,000 people. There's a clear relationship established with Northern California, where trees and logs and lumber and fish are being shipped down to that rapidly growing area. The Native American populations have been moved off the land. The land is now vacant, and the Homestead Act allows people to come in and settle it. And there's very clear demand for everything that can be produced in the Puget Sound area in Northern California. And we'll pick up our story there in the next video. Thank you very much for watching.